Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the third in our series of community webinars, community briefings for the new draft Willoughby Comprehensive LEP and DCP. And tonight we're talking about St Leonards. To begin with, on behalf of Willoughby City Council, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the traditional inhabitants of the land on which we stand, the Aboriginal people, their spirits and ancestors, and we acknowledge the vital contribution that Indigenous people and their cultures have made and still make to the nation we share, Australia. Before we get into the thick of the webinar, I'd like to cue a short video, which is an overview of the LEP and DCP as proposed and talks about the exhibition. So I'll cue the video with the Mayor and Dr. Deborah Deering.
Willoughby is a wonderful place to live. It is a city of diversity with beautiful landscapes, people, and of course our vibrant CBD.
Willoughby is a very diverse place. It has an important centre at Chatswood. It has some really much loved and very successful local centres.
Our residents really value our beautiful bushlands and of course our urban environment and our CBD.
It has a range of housing, quite a number of apartments and also a lot of lower density areas. It has important heritage precincts.
Willoughby City Council is committed to delivering a city that is green, livable, inclusive, connected, prosperous and vibrant. Over the last 5 years, we've engaged with the community to help us develop the local environment plan.
The Local Environment Plan, commonly called the LEP, is the planning instrument which actually sets the framework for future development.
In 2012, we created the Local Environment Plan to help us plan and decide what is built and where in Willoughby.
That's been proposed for change, significant changes. For example, in Chatswood, it is an important commercial place for the whole of the district, and even within Sydney, it has a key role. We want to make sure that's facilitated and expanded into the future. But it's hoped and anticipated that Chatswood will grow to be an even more important commercial centre than it isn't at this point in time. You will see in the LEP some major changes to the heights for commercial buildings and also the introduction of more apartment buildings close to the services around the Chatswood CBD.
It also covers affordable housing, environmental issues and bushfire hazards. The Local Environment Plan outlines subdivision sizes, heights of buildings and the amount of floor space area on which you can build. The plan allocates land for specific purposes through zoning and sets standards for development. It aims to provide jobs and housing growth, more medium and high density living, as well as strengthening the character of our CBD. It will help us design our homes for the future. It helps us guide conservation of cultural heritage as well as protect environmentally sensitive land. It helps us create a better place to live with more trees and connected pathways and cycleways.
We also want to link one green space to the other green space so that it's not just isolated green spaces and recreation opportunities, but they can be a network where they can be readily reached by foot, not needing to take a car. They're opportunities that we need to try to grow into the future. While COVID has thrown up some uncertainty about the pace of change, we do know that cities do grow. Willoughby is a very desirable place in the Greater Sydney area. Sydney is a very desirable city. It will grow into the future.
The plan helps us to set our strategic vision for the future.
Being prepared is important and planning ahead is crucial.
So I hope you found that a nice and succinct overview of what we're trying to do with the new draft LEP and DCP here in Willoughby. So I'll talk about how the webinar will run tonight. And the presenters tonight are myself, Norma Shanky-Williams. I'm the team leader for the strategic planning team. I'll be assisted by Ian Arnott, the planning manager, and Jane Gibson, a strategic planner in the team. And also from the local health district, Andrew Wheeler will be talking about healthy built environments. We have a number of councillors who are present tonight and listening in, Councillors Campbell, Erickson, Greco, Moratelli, Wright, Shah and Samuel, and the Mayor, Tanya Taylor, I believe, may be listening in as well. So welcome to those councillors. We have 74 registered for tonight's webinar, and there were supposed to be a number of people in person in the chamber, but so far we have an empty chamber, I have to say. This was supposed to be a hybrid, and thus far they have been hybrid webinars where we've had people in person and on the webinar, but tonight it seems we're just talking to people on the webinar. Any questions that you have during the course of the webinar can be submitted at any time in the question and answer function of the Zoom, so please do that. And staff will respond to these if they're straightforward questions tonight, but if not, we'll work on them and provide responses within the next 10 working days on Have Your Say. And so that's a commitment we will make. If there had been any verbal questions, if there's time at the end, we'll take questions from webinar attendees and try and answer some of those questions tonight. Any feedback and comments that are not questions, if you can put those in the chat area of the Zoom call, and we'll be able to see them there. Just for your information, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on Have Your Say by the end of tomorrow. And those asking questions in the chamber who won't be anybody tonight unless somebody comes later would have needed to know that because their image may have been recorded and their voice is recorded. So tonight the agenda is about giving you a bit of strategic planning background to this new draft LEP and DCP, a bit of background with some of the work the state government is also doing in terms of zoning name changes. And then we will move on to the local health district who will talk to us about creating a healthy built environment in Willoughby. We thought it would be Nicola tonight, but we're very pleased to have Andrew Wheeler with us tonight to do that presentation. Then we'll talk about St Leonards in particular for the draft LEP and DCP new controls and provisions. And we'll go through some of the detailed issues regarding St Leonards, and Jane Gibson will talk us through that. Then Ian Arnott will talk in more generic terms about the changes proposed in the LEP and DCP to do with housing generally. And we'll explain some of those controls, how they will work in terms of landscaping and dual occupancy. And we'll talk about affordable housing proposals and the DCP changes that we're putting forward. Then there should be an opportunity for questions, and I hope that we'll finish on time around about 7:30 tonight. So to begin, I'll talk about the headline changes of the LEP. The LEP is proposing some changes, some significant changes to Chatswood CBD, growing the CBD to the north and south, in line with the CBD strategy that has been adopted by Council. And we did have a Chatswood specific webinar last week, and we were able to go through some of those detailed changes with people who attended that webinar, and that will be available for others to view on Have Your Say as it was recorded, as I mentioned. There'll be increased density proposed in our local centres in line with our local centres strategy that was adopted by Council as well and publicly exhibited. In our industrial areas, we are proposing height and density increases so that we can try and encourage more inventive and innovative activities in our industrial areas and give an opportunity for more investment in those areas. And that's also in line with an industrial strategy that we exhibited and was approved and adopted by Council. There's a new design excellence requirement in the LEP. There's also a proposed increase in affordable housing from 4% to 10%. And that's associated with a feasibility report that's also available for public scrutiny. And we also want to try and manage urban heat impacts. So there are new controls in the LEP associated with that. We're trying to align our residential controls with the state code's state environmental planning policy for exempt and complying development, so that we're pursuing the equity around the sort of development that you can achieve, whether or not you have to lodge a DA or go under that SEP as complying development. So we're trying to make sure that they're better aligned to make for a less complicated system and a more fair system, a more equitable system. And also strengthening our landscaping controls, elevating them from our DCP to our LEP to give them more statutory force. The Development Control Plan seeks to strengthen our heritage controls overall, and also seeks to reduce our parking requirement, particularly for the railway precincts of Chatswood, Artarmon and St Leonards, where public transport is easily accessible. And we want to address congestion as one of the main themes of the new LEP and DCP, and that would be in the DCP. So this draft LEP and DCP are on exhibition for 12 weeks, and that takes us through to the beginning of June. So there's plenty of time, we hope, for people to consider, for you as a community to consider what is being proposed, and to submit your submissions on whether you think we've got it right or what we might have missed out or what we need to change. In terms of the process for getting to where we've got to, the draft LEP has been based on a number of specific strategies that were prepared to guide this new LEP and DCP, and they're to do with the Chatswood CBD housing, local centres, industrial lands, and affordable housing. So we have prepared those earlier strategies and brought them together under a local strategic planning statement, which was adopted by Council in 2020. Every council in New South Wales is required to have a LSPS, as we call it, setting that 20-year horizon for strategic planning. The draft LEP was formulated as a planning proposal, this is what it's called, and taken to the Willoughby Local Planning Panel for advice, who supported it, and reported to Council, who also supported it to be referred to the Department of Planning and Environment for what is called a gateway determination, seeking the state government's support to put this draft LEP on exhibition. The gateway determination was granted, and so we had to satisfy a number of conditions associated with that. And here we are now on exhibition with the draft LEP and the DCP together in tandem. The current LEP took some time to come to fruition. Work commenced in 2006 on what is known as the LEP 2012. And it actually was exhibited a couple of occasions. It was exhibited in 2010 and then re-exhibited in 2012. So it took quite a while to come to fruition. We hope it won't take as long this time. We're certainly putting our shoulder to the wheel to make sure it's a quicker process for everybody involved. It's now 9 years old, getting on for 10, I suppose. And we've had about 22 amendments since Gazettal. So it's ready for a refresh, we believe. And indeed, we're required by state government to undertake that refreshment. I talked about the local strategic planning statement before. Following the issue of district plans by the Greater Sydney Commission across Sydney, it was required that all councils prepare a LSPS, a local strategic planning statement, to set that 20-year vision with priorities and actions for the whole LGA, reflecting what was in the North District Plan and seeking to deliver the objectives of that North District Plan. So the comprehensive LEP now gives that statutory effect to the LSPS by implementing the planning controls provided in local strategies that we've already prepared, as I've referred to before, local centres and industrial lands and so on, and providing land use controls to achieve the outcomes we've sought in terms of a whole wide range of issues, including housing, economy, biodiversity, social infrastructure and collaboration. So it's about the line of sight, if you like, between the state objectives in the North District Plan leading down into the local planning that we do under our LEP and DCP. So the basis of this new draft LEP, as I've said, is drawn from the conclusions and recommendations of our existing strategies. And there are some covers to remind you of those strategies. There was the local centre strategy, the Chatswood CBD strategy, our industrial land strategy, and tonight in particular, the St Leonards Crow's Nest 2036 plan, which was not a council plan, but we participated with North Sydney and Lane Cove councils in the production of that plan by the state government in St Leonards, on the back of and triggered by the new metro station in North Sydney at Crow's Nest. The Willoughby housing strategy and the integrated transport strategy. They will all assist in responding to the new resilient Willoughby strategy and action plan, which was also endorsed by Council in 2021. And that new resilience strategy really seeks to strives for resilient places, to withstand climate change and sustain biodiversity and support vibrant and connected communities, and resilient buildings, which are safe, well-designed and affordable and sustainable. So we really have our work cut out for us to try and deliver on all those strategies we've already completed, and in particular, Council's Resilient Willoughby strategy, which seeks to have resilience embedded in the future work we do and the way that Willoughby grows into the future. Some of the key statistics that we're basing our strategic work on is the population is expected to grow from 78,000 back in 2016 by about 14,000 more people to almost 92,000 in 2036. The number of dwellings is expected to grow. We're planning for 6,700 new dwellings to 2036. There was a 5-year dwelling target set by the state government back in 2016, and we met that target of 1,250 new dwellings. And we will be working to the 2036 target of 6,700 new dwellings through the work in the LEP and DCP. And the number of jobs in Willoughby City is expected to grow from 64 to 74,600 in 2036, with a specific target for Chatswood CBD, which is why we're working so hard to make Chatswood remain as a strong employment centre for Willoughby. The state government's also been very busy with reforms while we've been trying to assemble our draft LEP, and they've already made some changes directly to the LEP in terms of environmental zones. So our former E zones were changed to C zones, conservation zones. And as you can see on that slide, the E zones have, as I say, been changed to zones C1, 2, 3, and 4. And C1, 2, and 4 are relevant for us, not C3. They're also in the process of changes to the employment zones in the LEP, the industrial IN zones and the B business zones. So there are transitions we're going through at the moment to change not only the names, but some of the uses that are appropriate in those zones at the moment with Council's LEP. At the request of the state government, we're exhibiting those transitional changes as well. And the outcome of this exhibition will finally be reflected in the LEP. So that is work that's being undertaken concurrently with the LEP. And it makes for a little more of a complicated process than we would otherwise like, but we think we can handle it. We're certainly trying to make sure it's as clear as possible for those who are making comments on it. Now I'm going to hand over to not Nicola Grosskopf, but to Andrew Wheeler, who will talk to us about creating a healthy built environment in Willoughby. And I'll let Andrew sit here. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Norma, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. As Norma said, my name's Andrew Wheeler. I'm the manager of the Healthy Built Environments team at Northern Sydney Local Health District. And if you haven't heard of Northern Sydney Local Health District before, we're a part of New South Wales Health, and we operate across the 9 local government areas in the Northern Sydney region, one of which is Willoughby City Council. The Healthy Built Environments program that I manage exists to help improve people's health and wellbeing in Northern Sydney by creating healthier built environments, ones which support people to be healthy as part of their everyday lives. And the broad banner under which we operate, known as population health, exists to help whole populations be healthy and ideally keep people out of hospital. So as we meet here tonight to discuss 2 important documents that will shape Willoughby's future and the lives of the people that live and work here for many years to come, I thank Council for inviting us to talk about the important connection between the built environment and health. And by way of context, when I refer to the built environment, what I mean is the human-made spaces in which we live, work and play on a daily basis. So our homes, our buildings, our streets, our sidewalks, our transport connections, and so on. And in this short presentation, I'm going to provide you with an overview of the connection between the built environment and health in order to set the context for tonight's presentation, and also for the discussion about the draft Willoughby LEP and DCP. However, before I do, I've got a question for everyone, and it's a simple question, which is, whoops, went a bit far. What makes you feel healthy? And also, how does the neighbourhood that you live in contribute to your health and well-being, both positively and negatively? And you're able to click there to put some of your responses in the chat. So how does the neighbourhood that you live in contribute to your health and well-being, both positively and negatively? Well, what we know is that all built environments are not created equal, and the environments in which we live have a profound impact on both our physical and our mental health. Healthy built environments support positive health outcomes by making healthy and active lifestyle choices easier. And an excellent resource that summarises this connection between the built environment and health and the many ways in which our built environments can positively or negatively influence our health is the New South Wales Healthy Built Environment Checklist, and that's available to download online. But here on the slide, you'll see the 11 themes around which the checklist is based, and each of those themes highlights a key area in which the built environment impacts our health and well-being. And communities that reflect these qualities are designed around the concept of healthy neighbourhood design. And by healthy neighbourhood design, I mean design that's facilitated by land use and development decisions as informed by documents like local environmental plans and development control plans that prioritise complete, compact and connected communities. Now, communities that reflect these qualities support physical activity along safe and well-connected tree-lined streets and paths. They also facilitate planned and also incidental social interaction as people have greater opportunities to meet in easily accessible destinations like local centres and shops. It also facilitates people meeting in areas of green open space. And they also support business activity and a strong local economy as neighbourhoods support and connect people to access key services like public transport when they do need to travel beyond the local area for work or leisure purposes. This diagram here captures many of those features of healthy neighbourhood design, and you can see here a neighbourhood designed around a connected and walkable street network linking to key destinations that are also co-located. So for example, you might have a primary school that's also located next to a library or a community centre or an area of open space. And what this does is it reduces the reliance on the motor vehicle for short trips, which in turn reduces local traffic congestion and promotes healthier and more sustainable forms of transport, such as walking and cycling. It also encourages people to spend time in their local neighbourhood, and this builds a stronger sense of connection and community cohesion. So there you have an example of how zoning and development controls can facilitate complete, compact and connected communities, and the ways in which these communities promote our physical and mental health by encouraging physical activity, social interaction, and also providing access to shops selling things like healthy food. Now, a central focus of the draft Willoughby LEP and DCP is housing, the third theme there of the checklist. And from a health perspective, the research evidence is clear that housing has a profound impact on our health and well-being. And the healthiest neighbourhoods are typically characterised by a diversity of housing types, with more compact housing such as apartments and townhouses located near centres, such as in the example seen here of the Chatswood CBD, but also many other areas of Willoughby like St Leonards and around the Royal North Shore Hospital precinct. Now, the word density can sometimes concern people, but what we know in general is that higher density housing that's well designed and appropriately located has an important role to play in our health and accommodating future population growth and providing people with more affordable housing options. We know that housing is a fundamental health need, and a diversity of housing types contributes to a diverse community, one in which people of all ages can live and grow over time. So thankfully, through appropriate zoning and best practice development controls, much of our higher density housing is setting a new benchmark for design quality, and then by incorporating things like green roofs and green wharves, as well as measures to activate streetscapes and minimise potential negative consequences of higher density housing, such as overshadowing of public space. But with all this said, as our cities do grow and develop, and as Willoughby grows and develop, we have to invest in open space, and not just the quantity of open space, but the quality of our open spaces. We know from research that Having open space, quality open space within walking distance to where people live and work is associated with a range of positive health benefits, such as reducing type 2 diabetes, blood pressure, stress, premature death, preterm birth, and so on. And of course, green and natural vegetation has a profound impact on the health of our planet, our environmental sustainability as well. And this leads me to the final theme of the presentation tonight, which is environmental sustainability and climate change. And these interrelated concepts are both major public health issues, and we can design our neighbourhoods in ways that protect our valuable natural habitat, provide shading through buildings and also planting of more trees, and mitigating against urban heat, as Norma mentioned earlier. So we can also, under this theme, future-proof our communities against natural hazards such as floods and bushfires and heat waves. Heat is a particularly pertinent topic. In 2020, for example, more people died of heat than car accidents, and heat-related deaths in New South Wales account for more deaths than any other natural disaster combined. Heat's also a significant issue that when it's hot and when we haven't designed environments that support us being outside during hot periods, then people are sedentary, they're not getting out and exercising, which contributes to our burden of chronic diseases. So environmental sustainability and climate change is another important topic that we can address through documents such as local environmental plans and development control plans. So I begun the presentation this evening with a question, and we'll end with another one as we look to the future. And that is, how will the neighbourhood that you live in contribute to your community's health and well-being over the next 15 to 20 years? The future is not just a place we're going, it's a place we're creating, and everyone has a fantastic opportunity to shape Willoughby's future by engaging with this consultation period on the draft LEP and DCP. So I hope this presentation has been some food for thought as to that important connection between the environments that we live in and how those environments shape our health into the future for better or for worse. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a very important part of the presentation, I feel, and it certainly reveals some of the key themes in our draft LEP and DCP that we're putting forward. Now I'd like to focus a bit more closely on St Leonards Crow's Nest as a neighbourhood, and I'm going to invite Jane Gibson to come and speak to you on that.
Thank you, Norma. Good evening, my name is Jane Gibson and I'm a strategic planner here at Willoughby Council. During this segment of the webinar, I will be talking about the changes proposed for St Leonards. The planning controls concluded in the draft local environmental plan, the LEP, are derived from the St Leonards and Crow's Nest 2036 plan, which was mentioned earlier by Norma. This plan was prepared by New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment. Initiated in 2016 and finalised in 2020, the 2036 plan sets out the groundwork for future development of St Leonards and Crow's Nest. The plan itself aims to facilitate the urban renewal of these areas for an expanding employment centre and residential community. The study spanned over 3 council areas, North Sydney, Lane Cove and Willoughby, and envisages 6,680 new homes and 16,500 new jobs. These targets are for across the 3 council areas. The image we're looking at on the left shows a familiar view of the St Leonards CBD looking west from the Pacific Highway towards the Forum. On the left of the highway is Lane Cove Council and North Sydney's on the right. The Forum shows the start of the Willoughby Council boundary. Although it's not in Willoughby Council's area, it's worthy to note the 2036 plan included provisions for a new metro station at Crow's Nest, which you can see in this image on the right-hand side. Scheduled to open in 2024, the station forms part of the new metro line, which will extend from Chatswood under Sydney Harbour through to Sydenham. You can see from the slide on the left the extent of the area which covered the St Leonards Crow's Nest study. The image on the right shows how the study was split into 3 council areas. For Willoughby, that included the Artarmon industrial area, part of St Leonards CBD, which is on our boundary, and the area north of Chandos Street. The 2036 plan sets the parameters for the changes. Our draft LEP takes these parameters and implements the planning controls to enable these changes to go ahead. Tonight, we will be looking at what those changes will be for our local government area. For Willoughby, the changes only relate to a handful of sites, as the majority of uplift occurs in our neighbouring councils. This slide is an excerpt from the 2036 plan showing an outline dash where proposed new height changes are to occur. Only some of these are within Willoughby LGA, that's local government area, and we will talk about these shortly. Worthy to note that no changes are proposed for Narromburn Conservation Area or the section of Willoughby Road just north of Chandos Street. There'll be further discussion later on conservation areas generally at the next section of the webinar. I will now look at specific areas and sites that have proposed changes included in the draft LEP. The main changes I will be highlighting are the increases to height of buildings and floor space ratio, which I will refer to as FSR. Anyone not familiar with that term, the floor space ratio is the gross floor area on all levels of a building divided by the site area. This slide shows a zoning map of Artarmon industrial area. The different colours show the various zonings. We are specifically looking at the light and darker purple areas, which show the Artarmon industrial land. There will be a separate webinar for industrial land, including Artarmon, but it's worth mentioning as 900 to 1,840 new jobs are envisioned for Artarmon industrial area by 2036. Existing employment lands are to be protected and to retain their current industrial zoning, providing jobs in essential trades and services. The plan supports intensification and the ability of these areas to adapt to change to ensure that they can continue to support economic growth and employment into the future. An increased FSR is proposed for consolidated sites in the light industrial area, which is shown in this particular map as a light purple colour. I'm now going to call out specific sites that have proposed changes. First one is 207 Pacific Highway, St Leonards. This site sits on Pacific Highway between Reserve Road and Herbert Street. On the slide, we're currently looking at the site just to the right of the tree, including the building. Current height controls vary across this site to a maximum of 13 stories. The draft LEP proposes a 25-storey commercial building across this site, which equates to 77 metres. Currently, the FSR of the site is 3:1 across the entire site, and this is proposed to increase to 10:1 with a 10:1 non-residential floor space ratio. Moving on to number 2 to 10 Chandos Street, St Leonards. This site sits immediately to the east of St Leonards Station. The picture on the slide shows the entrance to the council car park that you may be aware of, and the site also includes the Alto Ford car service centre to the right of the car park. Height and FSR changes are proposed for the site. Currently, the height control is 8 stories. This is proposed to increase to a 13-storey commercial building, which is 41 metres. FSR will change from 3:1 to 4.5:1, with a 4.5:1 non-residential FSR. A 110 to 120 Christie Street. The slide we're looking at now shows the street view of 110 to 120 Christie Street. The site sits behind the College of Law, which is bounded by Evans Lane. Again, height and FSR changes are proposed from a current 4 stories to a height of 6 stories, which is 20 metres. FSR increases from 1.5:1 to 3:1 with a 3:1 non-residential FSR. Incidentally, there are no changes proposed for the College of Law building site. Moving on to Chandos Street, from numbers 14 to 102 Chandos Street. The northern half of Chando Street is Willoughby Council and the southern section is North Sydney Council. 14 to 102 Chandos Street extends from the corner of Christie Street to Ryan Lane just before you reach Willoughby Road. This picture that we're looking at now is taken from Chandos Street looking west on the corner of Oxley Street. Now this section of Chandos Street was identified in the St Leonards plan as a potential change. However, the proposed 5 stories identified in the plan can currently be accommodated in the existing LEP height limit of 20 metres, as you can see from existing development on the site. Therefore, the only change relates to FSR, which is currently 1.5:1, and the LEP proposes a 3:1 FSR with a minimum non-residential FSR of 2:1. Before we move on, I should mention that all of these sites that we've just looked at will be subject to a design excellence clause in our LEP. For new buildings between 12 and 35 metres, a design excellence panel will review the development. For buildings over 35 metres, an architectural design competition is required to be held. In terms of contributions, although this is not driven by council, some of you may be aware that the St Leonards plan included a state infrastructure contribution known as a SIC to fund the infrastructure provisions required to support the area's growth. Recently, a proposed new framework for state infrastructure contributions has been exhibited by state government, with a newly called Regional Infrastructure Contribution replacing the SIC scheme. Proposed changes include the ability for expenditure to be focused away from areas that it is generated. Council has expressed concerns on this proposed change. And for those of you who are interested, you may want to look at the detail on the Department of Planning's webpage, which is shown in this slide. I'm now going to move on from the draft LEP to the Royal North Shore Hospital. Some of you might have heard of a proposal or viewed information which included on New South Wales Health and Department of Planning's webpage back in 2020 and 2021, included this image that you can see on the slide. It was called the Herbert Street Precinct and comprised of a number of proposals, including 500 dwellings, primarily for key workers, new commercial office, education facility, along with associated open space. The information on this slide was taken from New South Wales Health and Department of Planning web pages. Just for clarity, our draft LEP does not include any of these changes for Royal North Shore Hospital. It's our understanding this was a preliminary proposal and it has been re-examined by state government. So in conclusion, that was a quick overview to give you an idea of the specific site changes in St Leonards. I encourage you to look at the planning proposal and make comments on Have You Say Willoughby. If you live in a low density area, you'll be interested in the next section of the webinar. And I'm now going to pass you on to Ian Arnott, who will discuss the changes in those areas.
Thanks very much, Jane. I just mention that if you have been in any of our previous webinars, you may have seen this section of the presentation because the housing information is consistent across the LGA. So I'll be covering information that you may have already seen. Sorry. I'll get there. So as Norma mentioned earlier, Council has been given a target of 6,700 new dwellings by 2036. And in our housing strategy that we've undertaken and Council's endorsed, we've targeted 3 main areas for the provision of that additional housing. That's primarily around the Chatswood CBD, which is taking the bulk of additional housing through uplift in densities in the area around the CBD. It's also for our local centres, none of which are contained in the area we're talking about tonight, although there is some uplift in housing in St Leonards in the sites that Jane referred to. And it's also in our residential zones, the R3 and R4 residential flat zones, those areas that are already zoned for residential flat development that perhaps haven't already been taken up for that purpose. So they're the 3 main focus areas for increase in density and achieving that 6,700 target the state government set. The purpose of identifying those areas for the main housing uplift is to both because of their proximity to transport and services, as Andrew mentioned, in a healthy living environment, to have density close to transport nodes and services, but also to protect our low density zones, our R2 residential zones, and the character and amenity that those lower density areas provide, and also to provide that housing choice and diversity. As you can see, I have presented this before, and unfortunately I haven't edited it thoroughly, so I apologise for the last point there, which referred to West Chatswood. So just in terms of housing, the main changes we're proposing under the draft LEP, as Norma mentioned, was to align our controls with those that are applicable under the state government policy exempt and complying development codes, which allows someone to develop a single dwelling house or even a dual occupancy development and some other forms of housing as well, under what's called a complying development certificate, which may be without reference to council. It can go through a private certification process. In that, there is no merit assessment applicable to a complying development. It is entirely based on compliance with specified standards. We're looking to align with those standards, and where there is any departure from those standards would require the lodgement of a development application. So in terms of dwelling houses, we're looking to align with the state policy, with the exception of our landscaping controls, which we're looking to strengthen. As I mentioned, where our protection of our low density areas, a lot of the character that we see that comes from those areas is because of the garden character of the suburb, the opportunity for natural vegetation, and as Andrew mentioned as well, the benefit that opportunity for canopy tree planting, etc., provides to counter the urban heat effects. Similarly, with our dual occupancy provisions, we're looking to align those with the what's referred to as the code set, the State Environmental Planning Policy Exempt and Complying Development Codes. I'll talk a bit more about these as we go through this part of the presentation. The state government has also introduced a housing type called manor houses, which are traditionally four dwellings on the one site, traditionally the 2 up, 2 down block of flats. Under the state policy, again, that can be done as a complying development certificate, there's a minimum lot size of 600 square metres. We see that this is not achieving the maximum of the zones in which it's permissible, and we're looking to align the minimum lot size with that applicable to our other residential flat development of 1,100 square metres. We're also looking at changes to the affordable housing clauses consistent with that of our community strategic plan and local strategic planning statement, of increasing them from 4% to 10%. And I'll talk a bit more about all of these matters as we go through. So just firstly, in terms of bulk and scale of development, the provisions do provide for increase in the floor area of dwelling houses. This is to just give some examples of development that have been approved under complying development on the left-hand side and development applications on the right-hand side, to show that certainly, at least from a streetscape point of view, the scale of development is not significantly different. So I'm just going to run through our existing floor space ratio table under the current local environmental plan and what is proposed as a gross floor area calculation currently applicable under the state environmental planning policy, and what we're proposing to apply what is proposed under the draft local environmental plan. As you can see from the table on the left-hand side, if you were to go down to the line 301 to 400 square metre site area and go across, you can see there that the gross floor area achievable for a 400 square metre site area is 200 square metres floor space. If you go up to 401 square metres site area in the next line down, you can see that the amount of floor space you can achieve is less. So it's not a continuum, if you like, of increased floor area with increased site area. With the complying development tables, it is a continuum that as your site area increases, so does the floor space achievable for your site. That is, however, significantly greater floor space than is currently achievable. So the objective is perhaps twofold. One is to provide that continuum of increase that appears to be an equitable approach. Also to provide equity within a streetscape sense. If someone on one block of land can achieve a floor space significantly greater under a complying development, and yet you who are non-compliant in one small aspect of the complying provisions are required to put in a development application, under our existing controls, you aren't provided with the same opportunity of floor space that you would have otherwise been. That's where we see that there is a desirability to try and provide equity through aligning the controls. So I won't go into each of the examples in detail, but here, these slides, I should say, will be available to you on our on the website following the meeting, and it will provide you with opportunity to go through in a bit more detail. But I will cover another example in just one moment. So I also want to talk about landscaping. I did mention that we are aligning with the complying development codes requirements, with the exception of landscaping. What we're proposing to do is transfer what is currently our development control plan provision control for landscaping into the local environmental plan. The local environmental plan carries a lot more weight in terms of challenge or through the courts potentially, or to vary those controls. and a higher standard of justification for moving from the control is required. You can see on the table on the left-hand side being the control that currently applies under the existing development control plan and being transferred into the draft local environmental plan, that in each instance, the amount of landscaped area achievable is greater than that provided in the right-hand table, which is the landscaping provision under the state policy. And this is an example of floor space and landscaping for the application of the different controls for development of a site. So the site area is 650 square metres. The maximum floor space under the current control, 279 square metres. The maximum gross floor area control, so changing from a floor space ratio to a straight numeric gross floor area control, is 335 square metres, so significantly greater. In this instance, the development was approved with 312 square metres, so greater than the permissible under the LEP. They sought a variation of the standard and were granted that in this instance, but slightly less than the draft LEP would have allowed on the site. In terms of landscaping, the current development control plan and the proposed draft local environmental plan requires a provision of 266 square metres of landscaped area. The complying development code is only 195 square metres, and in this instance, 255 square metres was provided as natural landscaped area. So you can see that there is quite significant increase in floor space achievable, and we're trying to retain that landscaping component. And we have done some testing of these figures and determined that it is achievable to get that quantum of natural landscaped area while still achieving the floor space on the site, albeit meaning that there will be a greater two-storey component on sites. Those two-storey components will still be required to satisfy other standards, again, consistent with the code SEP in terms of setbacks, etc. I want to move on to dual occupancy as well and just talk through, firstly, the different forms of dual occupancy that are achievable. So in the top left-hand corner, this form of dual occupancy is referred to as an attached side-by-side dual occupancy, a form of dual occupancy where there are two dwellings attached and both with frontage to the main street. The top right-hand corner is attached one above the other, so what was traditionally known as a duplex. The bottom left-hand side is a detached, so no common wall between the buildings, but both with street frontage, in this instance being on a corner site, and so both dwellings have their own street frontage. And the bottom right-hand corner is a detached in a battle axe formation, so one house behind the other, with the only access being a driveway access. The state government provisions, what I've been referring to as the code SEP, allows the first three types of dual occupancy as complying development, but does not allow the third type, the fourth type, the battle axe form of dual occupancy. Again, we're seeking to align with the code SEP in this respect to prohibit battle axe form of dual occupancy development. And you can see from the bottom right-hand corner that there is good reason, we say, for prohibiting that form. It does tend to encroach into backyard areas and remove what is that traditional landscaped character of rear yard zones. It can result in overshadowing and privacy issues to neighbouring properties and bulk intrusion into those backyard areas. And of course, it does remove that garden character and that opportunity for canopy tree planting. So I'm just going to talk through how the controls change as a result. So the proposed gross floor area controls, consistent with the code SEP, for an attached side-by-side and detached dual occupancy, has a 25% of site area plus 300 square metres, so a formula calculation. And attached one above the other has 25% plus 150. So they're the to a maximum of 400 square metres. So they're the manner in which our controls would change, and I'll give an example in one moment. In terms of the landscape control, what we're proposing to do is make our landscaping control for dual occupancy development consistent with that we propose for single dwelling houses. Dual occupancy is proposed in the single dwelling zones, and we see that that's the character we want to retain, the landscape garden character. And so we want that same quantum of landscaped area to be provided. I should just point out that these changes that we're referring to in terms of both floor space and, sorry, in terms of the floor space changes are specifically for the R2 low density residential zones, not including heritage conservation areas and not including what were previously referred to as E4 environmental living, now referred to as the C4 conservation living zones. The other area of consistency that we're seeking to have with the code SEP is that subdivision would be of a dual occupancy would be approvable immediately. So up until this point, it has required only been permitted 5 years after construction and completion of the dual occupancy. So just running through an example, this is a attached side-by-side dual occupancy. And in this instance, it was a 730 square metre lot size. Attached is permissible on 700 square metres and detached on 900 square metre site areas, and those provisions aren't changing under the new LEP. Under the 2012 LEP, a maximum floor space of 292.2 square metres was permissible, and it was approved in this instance at that. Under the complying development SEP and our draft LEP, 482.6 square metres floor space could be approved. So that is a significant increase in floor space. That increase is already permissible under the code SEP. So someone could come and do a dual occupancy in these areas that complied with the complying development code and get a floor space of that amount. We're looking to align with those controls, but it is a significant increase in floor space achievable. Under our current development control plan provisions, the landscaped area required would have been 255.7 square metres of the site area. In this instance, 311.5 square metres was provided. Under the complying SEP, 265 square metres. More than our current DCP requires, is required for a site of this size. But under our draft LEP, consistent with what we're doing with dwelling houses, 308 square metres of natural landscaped area would be required. So I'm just going to run through an example similar to that last, sorry, I won't. I'll skip over this example just to allow a bit more time for questions, but this will be available on the on the web page from tomorrow. Well, I don't know what I did then. Sorry about this. Just run through. So just, sorry about that. Just in terms of manor houses, that form that I referred to, just increasing the provision from 600 square metres, currently permissible under the code SEP, to 1,100 square metres. Affordable housing, our current control for certain sites where residential flat development or shop top housing development is permissible requires 4% of the residential floor space to be provided as affordable housing. That's in addition to the permissible floor space on the site. So for example, if there was a 1.5 to 1 floor space ratio control, it would be 1.5 to 1 plus the 4% of affordable housing. Under our local strategic planning statement, there was a commitment to increase that 4% amount to 7% by 2021 and 10% by 2026. We've obviously passed the 2021 date, and it is a local environmental plan provision, and it takes time to come into effect. We're going straight to the 10% standard for affordable housing, as indicated in the draft local environmental plan. And we're saying that that 10% is to be in addition to the permissible floor space ratio on the site. So in the scenario of 1.5 to 1 floor space ratio, it would be that 1.5 to 1 plus the 10%, of which the 10% would be within the permissible floor space. There is a feasibility report that has been undertaken by SGS Planning and Economics for Council, which will also be available for consideration during the exhibition period. So that can be referred to and makes recommendations around that affordable housing component. I just want to quickly run through development control plan changes, and there are 12 parts proposed in the proposed draft development control plan. It's largely to make the development control plan a more user-friendly document. It incorporates a number of controls that are to be incorporated into the one sections of the DCP based on development type. So it makes it easier if you, for example, have a residential development to go straight to that residential section. It's not entirely the case, and there are some things that still sit outside of that, but there is much more that can be referred to specifically within those sections. So for residential, that's contained in Part B of the Development Control Plan, and talks about minor, which is the dwelling house dual occupancy scale of development, and major development, which is residential flat development and shop top housing forms of development. As I've mentioned, in the low density R2 zones, the controls to align with the SEP, with the exception of landscaping. In the environmental living zone or the conservation zone, C4, there are some additional, again, the landscape controls contained within the local environmental plan, and some additional documentation required in respect to applications adjoining bushland or where there are potential places of Aboriginal significance. In the heritage conservation areas, we're seeking to strengthen the controls we have there as well. It in some ways doesn't change the controls, but it really just highlights that our intentions are to retain the significant elements of our conservation areas. If we lose the buildings that contribute to our conservation areas, we lose our conservation areas in effect. So demolition of a building or a removal of significant elements is not supported. That statement is made in the Development Control Plan. It also identifies the sorts of information that would be required to be lodged with an application if you're seeking demolition and seeking to justify it for a building that is contributing to the conservation area. There are also additional controls for semi-detached development, something that has been not covered in our heritage section of the development control plan to date. And it reinforces the importance of protecting the external fabric and streetscape character. In the residential flat zones and for shop top housing, there's alignment with the apartment design guide produced by the state government, and where controls are not inconsistent with the apartment design guide, they would remain as they currently are. And there are some additional deep soil controls that we've included. Again, apologies, I've still got reference to Chatswood CBD. The same can be said for the St Leonards Centre, where Part B, as I've mentioned, refers to residential development, Part C to commercial development, and Part L, place-based controls, which would include some specific controls related to the St Leonards area in the case of St Leonards. Other DCP provisions that may require reference or specific reference in development being undertaken are the transport and parking management, where we're seeking to adopt the integrated transport strategy recommendations. This includes a travel demand management provision, which is looking at reduced parking provision where you're in close proximity to transport nodes. Also Part G, vegetation management, where changes were adopted in February 2020, and there's minimal further change to that section. Water management provisions, also with recent changes in 2019, and minor changes primarily to ensure clarity on some of the provisions in that part. And Part J, building sustainability, again, recent changes in 2020 and no further changes proposed. I think we're opening up to questions, and maybe there are some questions that have come through on the Q&A that we can speak to.
Hi, this is Tanya here. I'll just be reading out some of the questions that either Ian or Norma might like to respond to. We've got a tandem team down there now. First one's from Roger Prominence. If open space is so important in 2036 plan, then why hasn't there been any significant open space set in the Crow's Nest Metro Overstation development?
Very good question, Roger. What was being planned in that 2036 plan, and of course that was a state government product, was linkages to existing areas of open space. So improved linkages and walkways and pedestrian and cycling paths between existing open space areas to create more of a network, I suppose, which is what we often have to resort to do in urban areas where there's just no ability to actually create large new areas of open space, but to make them work harder and better connected. So you can actually get your exercise and your sense of well-being by moving between one open space and another. But there was no, you're correct, there was no huge area of open space nominated under the St Leonards Crow's Nest plan, Ian?
Certainly not in the Willoughby area.
No.
I think there was some pocket park in South St Leonards, was there, that the St Leonards Council were proposing, and some over railway plaza area. I think also in North Sydney, they also had their own plans for some additional open space, but
For Willoughby, no.
But not for the Willoughby area. We've got another question.
Yes, thank you. We've got one here from one of our new councillors, Councillor John Mortatelli. Can you give me more, Mortatelli, I'm sorry. Can you give me more detail about how the design excellence process works and what projects it applies to?
Well, in terms of the design excellence provisions, there is a separate process for the very high buildings over 35 metres in height, which requires a design competition to be held with a number of architects all proposing a different and exceptional design based on the the rules set in the planning proposal that will have been approved at that stage. This would come, the design excellence competition would come after a planning proposal had been agreed by council. And sorry, you can't hear me very well. I'm speaking across the microphone rather than into it, sorry. So that would be the most strenuous aspect of design excellence for those higher, more prominent buildings to undergo a design competition and come up with an agreed design scheme with a panel of architects to go forward to inform the DA process, which would be the next step in that process. For any buildings less than 35 meters, and I think above 12 meters, I think that was the height we took as the cutoff, there would be a design review panel process where any proposal would undergo scrutiny by a design review panel to make sure that the design that ultimately was presented at DA stage was the best it could be. So it not only includes design requirements, but also improved sustainability requirements so that the building can be the most sustainable as well as the best design that it can achieve. So we felt that just to not have any provisions like this would be missing an opportunity to improve the quality of buildings in Willoughby. And certain councils already run design competitions and review panels, such as City of Sydney, to great effect. And this results in a higher quality of design and sustainability in all their buildings. So we want no less for Willoughby. We want to make sure that we achieve that too. So that's why we've included those new provisions in the LEP.
Thank you, Norma. The next one's from Jonathan Stormont. What changes are being made for pedestrians and residents of the 6,000 new dwellings in all 3 council areas to access the 12 hectares of open space that is Gore Hill?
Could you repeat the first part of the question, Tanya? Sorry.
Sure. What changes are being made for pedestrians and residents of the 6,000 new dwellings in all 3 council areas to access Gore Hill space, open space?
It may be a question we need to take on notice on that. We'd have to go to the St Leonards Crow's Nest plan. I think there were some aspects of under highway improved provision around the station area and potential for further crossing to the north, to the west from the Oval to the Lane Cove Council area. In terms of other access, specifically to the Gore Hill Oval area, there is a provision, not sure if it's a new provision, but there is suggestion of changes to the overhead bridge from the railway line across to the hospital and through to Gore Hill. Norma, have you got anything you think to add to that?
In terms of specificities around improved pedestrian access to Gore Hill, the oval itself, I would only say that provisions will have to be made to improve the quality of the journey for new residents to get to that area of open space. And that would mean probably wider, better pavements and tree-lined areas so that it's sheltered from the sun and a more pleasurable journey to be made. But in terms of actually saying specifically what is planned, that is not something I can actually put the detail around at this point, but we'll include that question in our Q&A response and see if we can add some more detail to that in responding to it online.
Thanks, Norma. The next one is a question from Susan Dadswell. Susan's asking about if the Herbert Street precinct concept plan is being reconsidered.
Yes, we understand it is. We understand that what maybe most residents in the community would have seen last year or late the year before is no longer the scale or type of development being pursued by state government, that they are revisiting those plans, but we have no detail yet as to what that might be. We've been reassured that we'll be part of the conversation, which it seems we were left out of last year. So we have made sure that we're at the table now for any new proposals that might come forward for Herbert Street. Although council has made its position known that council wants to see medical and health related uses on that site in preference to any other arbitrary, if you like, residential or commercial uses, which would be better located elsewhere in the precinct. So it's a precious area of medical and hospital land that we want to see used for that purpose. And that's been stated publicly by council.
Thank you, Norma. The next question's from G. Hewitt, who was asking about a definition for the term key worker, as he finds it a little bit nebulous, that term.
It generally means those people who are performing the essential jobs in the community, such as nurses and tradespeople, those who are working in not particularly highly paid jobs, but are critical to the function of an economy or a local area. So they're key workers for the function of that society, but they often are not on high wages and therefore can't live in areas where they work and have long commute times to get to their work. So that would go to nurses working at the Royal North Shore who might have to commute from somewhere like the Central Coast to get to their shift. So it's a focus of, the mind is very much focused on how we can improve the lives of those people so that they can be able to live closer to where they work.
And just to expand on that slightly, the provision of affordable housing is generally for the purpose of key workers, and they're managed by a social housing provider and would require those eligible to be vetted to determine that they are within the salary bracket that is applicable.
Okay, the next one is from Barry D. Willoughby, Lane Cove and North Sydney converge at St Leonards, and as said, the new metro is driving a high population density development area. Already my view is St Leonards and its surrounds has been inundated with high rise and high population density development beyond reasonable sustainable levels. What in particular is Willoughby Council going to do with or without Lane Cove and North Sydney to ensure that St Leonards remains a community worth living in and not simply endless high density development?
Well, thanks, Barry. It's a very challenging question. I know that high density living is considered by many not to be a popular option, but it is almost an inevitable option for the future of our cities, because we don't have the luxury of everybody living in a house with a garden. Although we value that dwelling diversity in Willoughby, and that's what Ian explained, we're trying to protect by putting most of our housing targets into medium and higher density dwelling types, because we want to preserve the house and garden format, the house and garden dwelling type for the future. We think it's an important part of the diversity of housing we're offering. But in terms of higher density living, it needn't necessarily be a poor living environment. There are many parts of the world where higher densities lead to very vibrant and exciting and healthy ways of living, because people walk to get everything they need and are very strongly connected to their local communities. So it can be a very successful way of living in higher density, but you have to be clever about it and careful with it and make sure it's good quality. And that's what we're trying to do in terms of the densities we're providing or creating in both St Leonards and in Chatswood, that they are healthy and livable high density neighbourhoods and not poor quality development.
And again, I'll just add a little bit, Norma, if that's okay, just to say that in terms of the sustainable aspect, the location of higher density around the public transport nodes obviously encourages less car usage, takes more cars off the road and more reliance on public transport and more or active walking or riding in terms of accessing services, etc. So, and it also hopefully prevents the urban sprawl of a city spreading out into agricultural lands and other natural landscape areas.
The next question might have been answered by your responses just now. It's from Susan Dadswell and reads, if council proposes not to allow battle axe dual occupancy on the basis of overshadowing, how can they justify allowing an increase in height from 13 to 25 stories of a building directly opposite a residential building, which increase would completely eliminate sunlight, privacy and harbour views?
So it sounds like it's a specific situation you're referring to there, but in terms of a development application, there are considerations that are taken into account, but in the impacts of high rise to contain density in those easily accessible areas will result in some impacts. They will result in some loss of views for people and some level of overshadowing. However, the design of those buildings and the desire to keep them as slender towers seeks to ensure that any such impacts are short, have a short duration through the day and through the year, so that the shadows move in a fast pattern and at least some solar access to residences is achieved.
And it's such a different context as well. The low density R2 zones with single dwellings and garden areas is a completely different residential context to a central business district, where you expect density, you expect height, you expect a bit more intensity of residential activity than you would get in a low density residential area. So the expectations and the objectives indeed of those areas are entirely different.
Okay, the next question is from Helen. The current LEP shows 207 Pacific Highway at 12 stories high. The 2018 draft St Leonards Crow's Nest 2036 plan shows it at 18 stories high. However, without community consultation, the final master plan came out showing this area as 25 stories high. Is it possible to reduce the proposed to 207 height, as the JQZ building on the highway is 16 stories high and the Forum Highway building on the highway are 12 and 13 stories, which makes it out of context with the area. Sorry, it's quite a specific question. Not sure if you're...
No, but the short answer is yes. I mean, if we're genuine about this consultation and taking submissions, the answer is yes, that these controls are not yet set statutorily. They're taken from the 2036 plan into our draft LEP, but here's the opportunity for the community to comment on it and say what they consider to be their view, whether or not this is too high or, you know, Helen, you're saying it probably is, I think.
Okay, another question from Helen. I believe in social housing, however, am unsure about the so-called affordable housing. Can affordable housing be sold 10 years after development, which is just a windfall for developers? Can developers make a payment to council so that they do not have to put in affordable housing?
So there are probably two different aspects to the question there. So in terms of affordable housing being sold after 10 years, that is not the 4% to 10% provision of affordable housing that I was referring to. That provision is proposed within our local environmental plan, or is in the current local environmental plan as 4%, and is dedicated to council in perpetuity. The form of affordable housing that can be sold after 10 years is under the state environmental planning policy for housing, and that allows an uplift in floor space on a residential flat development where 50% of the residential component is provided as affordable housing for 10 years. So in that instance, it can be sold immediately, but is required to be used for affordable housing for at least 10 years after completion. That's not the one we're referring to under the LEP. It's the type that's dedicated. I think the second part of the question was about accepting a monetary contribution in lieu of the provision by developers. Our provisions seek to encourage it in the development itself, in the physical form, primarily because it's delivered sooner. The monetary contribution would require quite some time to accumulate the amount of money to provide development for the provision of that affordable housing, whereas as soon as the development being undertaken is completed, the affordable housing is dedicated and used immediately. The other aspect is integration of residents through developments so that they're not all just housed in the one complex is seen as a desirable outcome as well.
Okay, the next one is from Jonathan Stormont. The 2,200 dwellings being built in Lane Cove, St Leonards North and North Sydney, I assume, had extensive shadow diagrams which did not include the updated height of 2007 Pacific Highway. Was there any consultation with Lane Cove Council?
Consultation on, I'm not sure I understand the question actually.
I think
On 207 Pacific Highway.
It's referring back to Helen's question earlier, where there was a change in the height on 207 without further consultation. By that was at the time the state government was undertaking the St Leonards Crow's Nest plan. In terms of whether the state government had consultation with the councils on that, I don't think so. I think the consultation was at the earlier stages when it was at a different height. But as Norma said earlier, now is the opportunity to make submissions about that height if it's of concern.
That's right. I think one more question, Tanya, is that right? We're just about getting to the 7:30 deadline.
Sure. A question here from Michael Dawes. Could you please confirm whether the R4 area shown along the western side of Herbert Street north of the highway is new or existing?
Yes, my advice is that it's existing. Jane, that gave the presentation on St Leonards, is confirming that that's existing.
We might have time for one more quick question then. That was rather quick.
Sure. The 2000, oh no, I've done that one, sorry. 2 to 12 Chandos Street needs to have special and specific development controls in place. Any high-rise development will put at risk the flight path for the Royal North Shore Hospital helicopter landing pad. How will Lane Cove and Willoughby address this?
So I think it's Willoughby that you're referring to, because 2 to 12 Chandos Street is in the Willoughby Council area. And I would have to look at the provisions around the development control plan provisions specific to setbacks and things. In terms of the height, I would take it that has been considered in the St Leonards Crow's Nest plan that has specified the heights in terms of the flight path for helicopters for Royal North Shore. And there is potential for further consultation with North Shore around those matters.
Well, I think we'll probably call it an evening on those questions, and maybe we'll start to wrap up the evening. So thank you to everybody who's contributed those questions. We certainly dealt with more than we've done at any previous webinar because we had time this time, which was very gratifying. So we're on exhibition, as I said before, until the 7th of June, which is a total period of 12 weeks, which is quite an extensive exhibition period. And we'll be running in total 12 webinars during that period. This is number 3 tonight, and talking in specific details about each local centre as we go, and taking questions as we have this evening. So I hope you've all felt that it's been worthwhile and helpful in you formulating your submission. Your feedback today will be included in any feedback report that is produced, And that will be taken to council probably around October with the results of submissions and any changes that we believe need to be made to the draft LEP and DCP. The referral to the department then will be made, if that's a straightforward process, to make the new LEP after that council meeting. Unless, of course, there are significant changes proposed and we feel that a second exhibition is warranted. And then that further exhibition would probably occur towards the end of this year. And the plan would finally be made, we would hope, during the course of next year, 2023. But we certainly hope it won't be a 6-year journey like the current LEP was. We hope that we'll be able to deal with these matters very quickly. And so we encourage you to lodge your submission after tonight if you're particularly interested in the St Leonards area. And if you want to make a contribution on other local areas, there will be other webinars dealing with those places coming into the future according to our program. So is there anything else, Tanya, you'd like me to mention tonight?
Just that we will intend to email back a response to all of the questions tonight to everybody that registered for this evening, and any questions that are of a general nature will be added to our Have You Say website.
That's good. Thank you for concluding that. And thank you again, everybody. Thank you to my fellow presenters tonight. And thank you to you all for tuning into this webinar. I hope you found it useful, and good night.